Hi there. I'm Claudia Hosky from Fed Insider, and on behalf of the George Washington University Center for Excellence in Public Leadership and ServiceNow, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Digital Transformation as Infrastructure.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Albaum, and I am the Federal CTO at ServiceNow, and I have the pleasure of being today's moderator. So prior to joining ServiceNow, I worked in the federal government as a Chief Information Officer for many years, including as the CIO at the Department of Agriculture. And throughout my federal career, my teams and I always seemed to be on a mission to update and modernize our technology infrastructure. And ultimately, we were trying to digitally transform the way our agencies work to ensure the success of our mission. And that idea is really at the crux of today's webinar. When the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or otherwise known as IIJA, was signed into law in November of 2021, it allocated $1.2 trillion for infrastructure initiatives across the country. While the focus has been on large tranches of funding allocated for sweeping categories of infrastructure, things like roads and bridges or internet connectivity and water systems, less attention, I think, has been paid to the role of digital transformation within these groups. Now, digital technologies are at the heart of everything we do today. An agency's technology strategy is now also its mission delivery strategy, in my opinion. So, for instance, rebuilding or expanding water systems isn't simply about laying new pipes. It can include installing smart water meters, or setting up an online portal for customers, or digitizing and streamlining internal workflows to make customer and employee interactions more successful. Rebuilding bridges may also include embedding sensors to track variables such as traffic volumes or icing conditions. States and localities have the opportunity to incorporate these and many other digital innovations to maximize the value of these projects. And today, we're really fortunate to have 4 great experts share their thoughts on this topic. We're going to be talking about how to reevaluate long-term infrastructure plans and strategies to incorporate funding from IIJA. We're going to discuss ways that new infrastructure projects can incorporate digital transformation to maximize the value of these projects for users and communities. And we're going to define the elements of IT, information technology, and OT, operational technologies, along with cybersecurity capabilities and digital transformation activities that are currently and can be applied to these kinds of infrastructure projects. I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves. So as I call your name, please share a little bit on your background and describe your focus as it relates to infrastructure. I'm going to begin with Lee Jones, who is the director of the Rural Prosperity Network at my old agency, USDA.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is Lee Jones. I'm the director of, and that's a little bit of a misspeak there, but it's the Rural Partners Network at USDA Rural Development. But no worries there. No worries at all. And I'm the executive director for Rural Partners Network. I have about 24 years with rural development, most of which was spent at the state level in Louisiana as assistant state director, helping to deploy projects and deploy resources available through rural development. And for the last year or so, I've been working on developing and rolling out the Rural Partners Network. And it's a methodical rollout, and we're operating in 5 states right now. Those are Georgia, Mississippi, Kentucky, Arizona, and New Mexico. And we will soon be rolling out to an additional 6 states. And I want to call those out as well very quickly: North Carolina, West Virginia, Alaska, Nevada, Puerto Rico, and Wisconsin. Looking forward to rolling out more, and we definitely want to take advantage of this historic amount of funding that's available and the opportunity to collaborate. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, and Lee, having worked at USDA, I know that your team's become the face of the federal government in rural America, and you're able to make
Indeed
quite a bit. So I can't wait to talk more about that.
Indeed, thank you.
I want to introduce. I want to have Laurel Leverrier, Assistant Administrator, Telecommunication Programs, also at USDA, introduce herself.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laurel Leverrier, and I'm the Assistant Administrator of the USDA's Telecommunications Programs. In that role, I get to oversee USDA's 5 telecommunications programs. Most of our programs are focused on providing funding to private entities, sometimes to communities as well, to extend broadband service into rural communities where that service doesn't currently exist. We have a number of programs that we are actively engaged in working with our community partners and our private sector partners to expand those networks, and I'm really looking forward to joining the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurel. Next, I'd like to have Shannon Mccarthy, who's the Communications Director and Special Assistant to the Commissioner for the Alaska Department of Transportation Public Facilities, introduce herself. Shannon?
Thank you. Shannon McCarthy. I am the Communications Director for Alaska DOT. And for those of you who are not familiar with what Alaska DOT covers, it's actually quite extensive in terms of transportation. We cover roads and highways, obviously, and then we also have a marine highway that covers about 3,500 marine miles for the state, coastal communities. And then we also have an aviation system in which we have approximately 235 airports that we take care of, including 2 internationals. So it's a lot of work to do, and what I've spent the last 25 years of my career doing is really learning how to reach and engage and really incorporate the public into our transportation program. And now we're tackling more of internal communications. With all this additional IIJA money, we also have to be very concerned about making sure that our staff has the tools and resources that they need to be successful.
Right, and to be able to manage those funds is no simple task. So we're going to talk more about that as we move on. Last but not least, I'd like to have Dr. David Mussington, who's the Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at CISA, introduce himself. David?
Thanks. This is David Mussington. Great to be joining such an august group. My title is evidence of sort of a scope creep into the job. I'm responsible for the infrastructure security programs at CISA, broad spectrum from doing assessments of physical infrastructure, physical and cyber physical infrastructure, to make sure that cyber hygiene and other security principles are used to assess the fragility of critical infrastructure, and that's infrastructure that will be rebuilt and refreshed through IIJA, and other infrastructure through a set of services that we deliver to state, local, territorial, and tribal stakeholders, and to critical infrastructure stakeholders across the country. The priority is to make sure that decisions that are made are security risk informed, and hopefully to help people make new projects more defendable, more defensible, and more secure.
Thank you, David. We're going to be talking more about risk as we go on. We'll be sure to have you highlight some of the great work you're doing at CISA in support of these efforts. So, I want to get started with a question to Lee. Now, the infrastructure bill includes $1.2 trillion, as we discussed, for lots of different kinds of initiatives. And, you know, with your focus on rural America, how do you think these, how can digital tools help make these projects successful?
That's a great question, Jonathan. Thank you for posing it. First I want to say that, in Rural Partners Network, we are so very much looking forward to the extensive partnerships that we're able to establish with various federal agencies and our local and state partners, among others, and especially looking forward to collaborating and connecting with Shannon as we get ready to roll out to Alaska here in the very near future. I think about, from a rural focus, we're talking about, the potential project delays, and, frankly, project delays tend to be kind of a fact of life when you're rolling out federal, especially on the federal projects. But that's only exacerbated by rural projects, and even more of a risk when we're talking about the more distressed rural areas, which is the focus of the Rural Partners Network. Of course, resources are more scarce, providers are more scarce, and things like that. So we feel like the network represents an opportunity for collaboration. We have 20 plus federal agencies that are at the table actively engaging with us because we recognize that anytime you're talking about historic amounts of funding, it could either be a new normal or it is what it is. It's a historic amount of funding, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we take advantage of that while we have it. So it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop there. We're also working collaboratively with state and local governments and private and philanthropic partners to leverage each other's resources. My point there, though, is through the intentional and unique partnerships paired with, a heightened use of digital tools to manage projects, I feel like we can ensure that rural communities have an optimal chance at success, especially as it relates to tech projects. And I would be remiss if I didn't state we can no longer assume that rural communities have less of an interest in the digital space. We want to play a role in shrinking that digital divide between rural and the more densely populated, resource-rich areas by making sure that those opportunities are available and accessible by our distressed rural communities that we're focusing on through the Rural Partners Network.
It becomes really an equity issue on
Exactly.
some level. With people don't have the same access to technologies, and therefore they don't have the same access to resources or other educational opportunities and things like that. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And as I think I shared in one of our prep sessions, when I spent time at USDA, it was sometimes questionable about the connectivity in a rural community.
Mm-hmm.
And without high-speed access, and Laurel, I'd love for you to jump in on this. There is limited ways to serve customers at times, or a tool we build that works in the Washington D.C. area doesn't work in a rural community, and we don't get the most out of the technology investments we make or the infrastructure investments. So, Laurel, I'd love for you to share a little bit about how you're bringing telecommunications capabilities into these areas of the country that maybe haven't had them in the past.
Yes, absolutely. So at USDA, as I said, we have a number of programs that are investing in our rural communities to provide funding to extend broadband. I think the one that gets the most attention right now because it has the most funding is our Reconnect program. And in the last 2 years, we've provided $1.5 billion in funding through that program. And I would just note that, we've started running that program in 2018. Right before the pandemic. And I think the biggest sort of takeaway for us after the pandemic was in rural communities, the need for broadband service became so critical and essential, right? We all know we use broadband every day, but, suddenly your child couldn't go to school. And, we know that these broadband networks that we are helping to finance provide opportunities for rural communities to have access to distance learning, telemedicine, which is so huge right now. There's so much going on in that space. And then additionally, and especially in rural communities, we know that our rural homes equate to rural businesses, and they need robust broadband in order to compete in the digital marketplace. So we really see broadband as a way to help level the playing field for our rural communities, but only if they have that access there.
Mm-hmm. Shannon, I'd love for you to pick up here. You're representing state of Alaska. There's obviously a lot of communities in Alaska that can benefit from technology, and we have funding now to do so. And I'm sure there's a connection into the work that you're doing in the Department of Transportation. So, how do you see this bill bringing capabilities and opportunity into your communities?
Well, it really represents a significant opportunity for us. And you had mentioned earlier that, or perhaps another speaker did, that there shouldn't really be a gap between the needs of a rural community and needs of an urban community in terms of they all need this transportation, these upgrades. One of the things that we have to be mindful of when we're developing projects and reaching out to the communities is to make sure that we're providing a wide variety of technology for them to tap into. And just thinking back to an example, when we were doing a public meeting, we had this very high-tech streaming capability. We were streaming to social media, streaming to a website. We also had a phone line open, and we had made an arrangement with a local radio station to repeat the audio from our phone line. So to really be creative when you're working with rural communities while they're building up that infrastructure, to make sure that you're still keeping everyone informed and allowing them access.
That's a great point. You really have to meet people where they are and provide multiple channels. The government's not a private sector business. It's not only going to do it the most singularly efficient way. We have large groups to support. So I think that's a really important complexity for people to hear and recognize, and impacts, the way you do your work. And I think that's going to come up more as we continue our conversation. David, I want to pivot to you for a moment, because these projects that we're talking about, they carry a lot of risk. Project risk, can they get the work done, but also cyber risk. And you touched on this in your opening remarks. How can we use technology to mitigate these risks, and what's CISA doing specifically?
First, thanks for that great question. I think that it's important to note, to always balance the way we portray these things with the costs and the benefits. Obviously, these projects are designed to deliver benefits to stakeholders in rural America and to other American citizens. And while it says that we focus mostly on risk and risk mitigation, we know that these projects aren't launched to minimize risk. They're launched to deliver benefits. So what we try and do is emphasize adherence to some best practices, which you will hear me describe under the familiar labels of cyber hygiene, security by design, patching of at-risk systems, which is basically all systems, and the provision of technical advice or consultancy to our field force, where we have 10 CISA regions, which are the same geographic footprint as FEMA regions. But we really emphasize the idea that if you take cyber risk seriously when a project's being devised, it'll be less disruptive to project execution, and you're more likely to have long-lived risk mitigation impact. And what does that mean? That means that, at least for us, we have a field force of over 140 protected security advisors and a similar number of cybersecurity advisors and other security specialists around the country that can provide technical assistance and advice alongside a set of digital services that are available online, CISA.gov, to anyone who is launching an effort under IIJA or any other similar grant opportunity. So we're here as a service provider, we're here to give advice, and we're here to ensure that best practices are visible to those who can benefit from them.
Well, and David, just building on that, the idea of getting the risk and security teams engaged early in projects always is always sounds good, and we always want to do that. But my experience, there's a lot of excitement about getting the money and getting started, and people want to jump into design or building something so quickly. They don't have time for security. But we should all have time for it. It's all of our responsibilities. So any ideas or suggestions for the panelists or people in the audience who want to do what you just said, but maybe don't know how to engage early?
So, I think the first thing to do would be to go to CISA.gov and look at our service catalog and look at some of the services that we have available. We have self-help or self-deployed services for everything from assessments of infrastructure to FAQ files on what to do about cyber risk and project management, to actual humans to provide technical assistance who are in the regions and localities where people actually live. So I think that finding out who your local protective security advisor, by going to CISA.gov or going to our 800 number, which of course I don't remember right now, but I will have that before the end of the call, that allows you to put a name and a face to your local community, to a project in your local community, so that you can do outreach. We also have 10 CISA regional offices which can do outreach to localities which are thinking of applying for some of the grant-based access points to some of these projects. So a combination of accessing services through our domain, CISA.gov, and outreach by our field forces will, I think, provide at least a portfolio of services that might be of use.
Very, very good, and it really builds into this next concept that I want to talk about: communication. So you're describing, David, ways to begin a conversation around risk, but and Shannon, I'm going to address this question to you, but I'd like for you all to think about how to respond. But Shannon, these projects that you do are really complex in Alaska, and they require a lot of parties to make them successful. So can you talk about the communications tools and techniques used at the Department of Transportation to coordinate across a lot of teams and a lot of stakeholders that have an interest in the work you're doing?
Yeah, so we're doing a couple things. Obviously, we really do have to rely heavily on technology to bring people together over a large geographic area. So we're using some really high-tech virtual platforms, virtual meeting platforms, and things like that. But we're also starting to develop some online tools for when a rural community or a small community would like to apply for a discretionary grant, for example. We're developing an intake clearinghouse so that when they have an idea, we're able to interact with them relatively quickly, and they can identify, the sponsor, the project, and we can hook them up with resources right away. Smaller communities oftentimes don't have the capacity to take a federal project from beginning to end because of maybe they lack the contractual expertise. But we're putting them together with those experts, those grant writers, those contractual experts, all the technical support that they need to be successful. So a wide variety.
That's a great. Mm-hmm. No, that's a great service, and it's going to make a difference in again, create opportunity. I think for more groups to get access than not.
And Jonathan, I'd like to jump in there.
Yes, go. Yeah, I was going to say, Lee, what do you
were calling to me?
Yeah, please.
So I'm thinking in terms of Rural Partners Network. I think about how we rolled out Cohort 1 in the midst of a pandemic, and we did all of our engagement sessions virtually using Zoom. But here in the near future, one thing that I'm most excited about that's a function of Rural Partners Network, well, two things really, is in terms of access and engaging early. So it does kind of touch on your last question as well. The federal partners, are not situated the way rural development is in terms of the way of our reach into rural communities. But what they're doing is they're identifying what we're calling rural desk officers. That's kind of a front door to each federal agency so that we can have that early engagement. And then the most exciting thing about Rural Partners Network for me is the creation of kind of a one-stop shop in terms of what we're calling rural.gov. That's rural.gov. It is in existence now as a landing page where we're just kind of collating resources, but in the future, the vision is that, as we outreach it and make people more aware of it, that a rural community, a rural business, just a rural stakeholder in general might come to rural.gov, search for whatever it is they're looking for, whether that's a particular type of program, if they need water resources, broadband resources, whatever, being able to connect them to the federal agencies that offer the offer the opportunity to address that issue that they may be having, but also an opportunity for for them to get helpful tips, grant writing tools, grants management tools, those kind of things. So rural.gov just presents an excellent opportunity for us to be even more responsive to the needs of rural communities.
Lee, I like how you keep saying rural.gov, rural.gov, rural.gov. Hopefully everybody hears that, rural.gov. No, it's great. I mean, you're making an excellent point. If you need assistance, you shouldn't have to know what, and you're a citizen, you're a person in rural America, you shouldn't have to know what all the programs are and where they all sit. Exactly. Navigating all those individual bureaucracies is a full-time job. So if you can create a front door and behind it have a capability that connects people to programs and systems and data that supports them, you're changing the way people think about their federal government. And we know we need to, as people who work in and around government, it's very important to make it very clear how the government is there to help. I really do believe they're there to help. That's a great example.
And while rural.gov is in development right now, I will state that the rural desk officer that I referenced, that we are up and running with that. So as rural communities need resources or need access to federal partners, we're able to make the connections to those rural desk officers and get those resources now.
Very good. And so go ahead.
Sorry, just to make the same token, as I said, I'd provide a one-stop shop for CISA, and here we go. Central@CISA.gov. someone wants to know who their particular security advisor is locally, sending an email to that domain will get you a response very quickly with a named person and contact information. Going to ServiceNow will also get you into the program portfolio so that you can choose what you think is appropriate for your needs.
David, can you share that email again? You may have cut out for a moment.
Sure, sorry, central@cisa.gov.
Very good. So I know that after this presentation, people will get an email with information related to our presentation. And David, when you get that request, please include that information. And Lee, if you want to include information about rural.gov, you'll have an opportunity to share that out with everyone who's participating. Yep. So we actually have a couple of questions from the audience that really fit in with this conversation we're having, and I want to pivot to those for just a second. The first question came in when we were talking about the introduction of these questions came in when we were talking about the introduction of new technologies. And first question is, how do you address communities that want access to technology, but at the same time also see much newer technology as an intrusive element to their privacy and daily lives? This combination between access and opportunity and am I going to give somebody my data? Am I going to interact with the government? You're all dealing with that on some level. I'm curious if there's anybody who wants to jump in and provide some perspective.
I'll take that first, just as a theme setter. I think it's what we think about a great deal in terms of access should not mean compromise of personal privacy or any other sensitivities that one might have. We offer best practice guidance on how to protect one's identity using high-value services. As our director Eastleigh says, multi-factor authentication, using more than just a password to secure one's data when accessing a service, is a central defense against someone getting a hold of your data and abusing it. Also, we think about what we expect of service providers, when they get your data, when they receive your data, what expectations you should have, and what you should ask providers about what they do with your data beyond the immediate service that you're purchasing. So best practices, access to services at cisa.gov to describe what some of the vulnerabilities or risks might be, and some guidance on what to do about it is basically our perspective.
Well, those are great points, David, about the technology and the controls behind the data. But to Lee and Laurel and Shannon, you're dealing with people in rural America or communities that may not be trusting of the government, or maybe not be trusting of organizations to manage their data. How do we have you had conversations with anyone that you're in the past, people in the communities that you serve, where people are suspicious or skeptical about what are you going to do if I take on this money, or I take on this service and share my data with you? Has that come up in your worlds?
This is Shannon McCarthy.
Go ahead, Shannon. Why don't you go first?
Okay. Yeah, it absolutely has come up in conversations. And when we use technology, we're actually trying to make sure we offer the ability to be anonymous. And it is one of those things that we really work on trust with our communities, because we do want them to be able to access the same way that other folks are accessing, from urban areas. So trust is important, and then providing them those options that should they want to interact anonymously, to provide that as an option.
And do you find when you offer this ability to be anonymous, people believe you? They believe it and they buy into it, or is there still a skepticism?
We have found that people buy into that option. Yes.
Well, very good. I'm encouraged to hear that. Laurel, I think you were trying to jump in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the programs that I oversee at USDA, when I thought of this question, there were two things that I think similar to Shannon. I've definitely heard concerns from individuals and our clients of ours regarding, privacy concerns. And I also think, one of the things we try to do is really defer to the communities and the entities themselves to make decisions about what makes the most sense for their community. For instance, I work in the telecommunications space. People have a lot of strong opinions about putting up wireless, putting up cellular towers in certain communities, whether that's a concern about potential impacts of those radio frequencies on people's health, or whether those concerns be about just sort of the look of those towers. And so we always try to work with those communities to really get a sense of how can we work together to bridge those concerns. Sometimes it means we have to locate the equipment maybe in a slightly different place, maybe not in a housing development or something. The other thing, but I think really more to the crux of this question, privacy rights, absolutely. And for our clients at USDA, most of the folks who receive funding through our programs are cooperatives, for-profit companies, and that's always the first thing they want to know. And a lot of our entities also are regulated by the FCC. And so we get a lot of questions about, well, are you going to share this data with the FCC who regulates us, and what could be the impacts of that? So, I think most of it is just more about wanting to have awareness, and maybe there's a little distrust about how it's going to be used. And so we try to, approach those things with education about why we ask for things, what the purpose is. But yeah, we always laugh in my office, hey, we're the federal government and we're here to help you. Truly, there is, I think, just a personal perspective of wait, you're who, and you're going to help me how? So anyway, thank you.
Well, I saw the same things when I worked at USDA, introducing services to simplify interactions. Sometimes were viewed as intrusive, or we got a lot of questions about why we were attempting to provide a service and have somebody do something online when they used to be able to go into a county office. So there is you have to meet people where they are, and if that exists, I think Shannon, you and Laurel, you're describing ways to overcome that, which is really positive. I'm sure much appreciated. And there's a follow-on question, Lee, that I think maybe you might be interested in addressing about potential resistance to change of introducing technologies or maybe even new infrastructure capabilities into rural communities. Are you seeing a resistance to starting projects or help from the federal government at all?
Absolutely. And I think by and large there's wide scale support for what we're attempting to do in Rural Partners Network. But at the same time, that does not get us away from, that concept of, I'm sure most folks are familiar with that NIMBYism, the not in my backyard. There's always going to be naysayers and detractors, and how we work past that is by being inclusive on the front end and making sure that we're receptive to what these individuals or these organizations or whoever it may be, receptive to their concerns and respectful of those concerns as well. And I think that just really goes a long way in ensuring the success of any given project that we may be pursuing. And I have a present example of that on a project that we're working on in Greenville, Mississippi. And of course, there's a fair bit of pushback on that, but at the same time, it's such a great opportunity from an infrastructure perspective for the region as a whole that by and large everyone sees the vision. But there again, I just reiterating the need to be respectful of other perspectives and addressing those where appropriate.
Right, and so there's this one side of what you're describing. There's a NIMBYism, or there's maybe a resistance, but at the same time, the pandemic, really spurred the adoption of new technologies, and
that's right.
It's changed the way people interact. Is that changing expectations, you think, in rural America and in elsewhere, as people are considering how to use the funding that's in this infrastructure bill?
Well, Jonathan, the way you just
go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was about to say the way you the way you described it there, just in terms of making it real to that person sitting at home. your use of technology has changed so much through the pandemic, just in the way that you communicate with people. Folks that may not have, might have an Apple phone but have never gone near a FaceTime, things like that. So if you can make it resonate in that way, make it real to them, make it personal, I think that goes a long way in making sure that we can explain what we're trying to accomplish through this broader project, and help folks see the bigger picture that may be detractors in the early going. But again, it's important to get that, to establish that early on.
Shannon, are you seeing that in Alaska as well?
Yes, very much so. In fact, I was just anecdotally thinking about a in-person meeting that we just had. We finally decided we could meet in person, and we had an outcry from the public because we weren't streaming it to social media. So we ended up streaming it to social media so folks could listen at home. And now I'm finding that we're doing it all. We're streaming, we're recording, we're transcribing, we're doing phone access, texting. We're using as much technology to meet people where they're at.
Yeah, and that's definitely a best practice in government or in industry. We know that, we often talk about the future of work, but it's the future of government, it's the future of communications, the human interaction is hybrid. It's going to be in person for some people, and it's going to be, at my convenience to stream it other times. And sometimes I might want to stream it, sometimes I might want to attend in person. But I expect access to meetings, or I expect access to work or communication under any circumstances. And that's a real evident change, I think, in the way, I've been interacting with people in government over the past couple of years, and you're sharing that. And Laurel, you highlighted, you mentioned the pandemic before, really highlighting the need for broadband technologies in rural America. And that was a real challenge, I guess, in the early days of the pandemic. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on areas as broadband comes in, capabilities that you see really spurring rural America forward in this country. What kinds of things are they longing to do that may be missing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, after the pandemic, I think in looking back at data that we have access to, it's very clear that the bandwidth that we are all using at home went up significantly, right? And it's not surprising when you consider the fact that suddenly, I'll speak personally for my home. My husband and I both worked outside of the home. My kid went to school, and suddenly in the pandemic, we had two of us that were working from home, Zooming online with, a first grader who was also doing school online. So I think that the pandemic changed the way that we're using broadband at home, where there was a more essential nature to having that access in the home, right? Because suddenly people were able to go out and access it the same way. So I think, number one, we saw a huge uptick in the bandwidth that consumers were using both in urban and rural communities. And then I think the thing that really is specific to rural America is those folks who didn't have access to broadband. It was a critical issue that kept them from having access to a lot of things, right? You think about school kids who, when everybody else went online, if you didn't have online at home, you couldn't access that. So I think certainly we also saw a more personal need for that access within the rural homes.
Yeah, and that's the human element that we've been talking about before. My school goes online and I can't get online. My kids are out of school. They can't learn, and it was always there, I think, is a point you were making, but the pandemic just highlighted it and really made it so visible how disparate the availability of these services were. And we should be proud as a country, I think, that we passed this bill that will create some parity and bring equity. And there's so much that you're going to be able to do with these funds to change people's lives. And that's so much of what government is about and what the USDA is able to do. So I think it really deserves to be to be highlighted here. So thank you for your work here. I want to ask David a follow-on question. As we're adopting all these digital tools, and you've talked about, in the context of these projects, rolling out good cybersecurity tips and whatnot. But for implementing these projects, but what advice do you have for the users of these technologies and the workforces in these organizations doing these projects? How do we educate them on digital tools and related cybersecurity risk?
So, I think that first, as I said when we started, I think it's clear that these projects are being done to convey benefit to users, and that's got to be the highest value here. Unfortunately, the same expansion in broadband and the same expansion in use of online services has brought with it really steep uptick in abuse, from ransomware to identity theft to denial of service and a whole combination of malware issues in between. I think that there's some guidance that CISA offers on CISA.gov and through other outlets through our regional forces that advises people on what the risks actually are. I think it's best to have a clear-eyed view of what some criminal may want to do to you or want to steal from you when you access high-valued services, be it the security of data on our students in schools, to transacting business with a distant online vendor or outlet. There are risks, and there are things like password policies and other acceptable use policies that businesses, small businesses, and levels of government can adopt to reduce the risk that they'll be abused. So some of that can come from online sources of information, CISA.gov and partners. For example, there's something called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative that is CISA and a group of online service providers that provide best practice guidance and services to citizens and to businesses on what risks they can try and avoid. I think secondly, there are some things like multi-factor authentication and other cyber hygiene practices, again, listed on CISA.gov that can advise citizens, local governments, and small businesses on what to do and what to avoid when they're using services. For example, don't use the same short password on multiple sites that you go to, because that's going to heighten your vulnerability to someone stealing your identity in one place and then accessing services across the board. So also think about the cybersecurity risks for your children who may be accessing online services but don't fully understand what can happen over time if their identities are stolen. So, it's a cliche to say we're from the government and we're here to help you. But CISA is from the federal government, obviously. It is offering advice, self-help tools, and human beings to come out and talk to communities that have risk concerns, because there is concerns are legitimate for criminals out there too.
And Lee, I suspect that there's tremendous opportunity to get some of this education out into rural America, and I don't know if rural.gov has a connection into some of these resources, but
if I can just
sounds
add,
like there's.
If I can add another point, I would say that our services are, although the taxpayer is paying for them, for citizens they are mostly free. So if you go to CISA.gov and you put in a question into our search bar, you're most likely going to find a free publication or tool, an online tool, a self-help tool, an assessment tool that might actually meet your needs without you spending any dollars at all. And that's something we've tried to work on.
Lee, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lee.
And appreciate the flag. I'm becoming more and more aware that it's incumbent upon us and Rural Partners Network to ensure that we make that connection to CISA as well. I mentioned that we're at 20 plus federal agencies now, and I recognize that list is ever growing, and CISA may very well play a role there. And in terms of rural.gov, the beauty of rural, another thing about rural.gov is not designed to take the place of any existing website that's out there. I think ultimately, anytime a constituent may be seeking a particular resource, it should eventually roll them back to the agency that's that can be responsive. And in this case, if CISA has creative tools that can, that can help, answer some of these concerns in rural areas, it makes sense for us to possibly feature those items on our site periodically as well. So I think there are definitely opportunities to collaborate here and making sure that we're using rural.gov to the full extent that it can be used. And it's such a visionary site that we're really wide open in terms of what we feature on the site.
I should say that we welcome the opportunity to work on that.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Mussington.
We're creating connections, and hopefully in doing the right kind of work here to make resources that are available to all Americans really available and accessible. And so it's great that you two are having this conversation. We're all getting to learn together.
That's right. If we were on Teams or Zoom, I'd be hitting my hand clap button.
Right. That's right. Now, Laurel and Shannon, I'm curious, as you're working in your in your communities, are you seeing the need for education about how to use digital tools? Are you seeing that with your workforces to get them up to speed, to get the most out of these investments that we're making in digital technologies? Shannon, I'm curious what your experience has been.
It seems like the public is actually pretty quick to adapt and pretty patient with us when we are trying out a new technology. Our workforce, however, we absolutely need to make sure that we're providing them the support and the training that they need. And you can never assume that just because of someone's age that they might be more open or less open to technology. It really is an individual thing, and we need to make sure that we're providing it. It's tough because technology is moving so quickly, but we are providing that to our employees. It's just super important.
Laurel, are you seeing the same things?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think people are really quick to adopt these things for themselves. They see the connection to their life, whether it's being able to, get online to have your doctor's appointment or, a variety of different things. But I do think the challenge that I see is from a workforce perspective. There are certain types of, roles that are needed for these types of networks that we finance that I do think that's a challenge, and making sure that we have that workforce there to support where there's the need. And I think it's kind of interesting because then when I think about with my work, quite frankly, the federal government is behind the private sector in terms of deployment and the adoption of technologies. And so, I think we definitely have some catching up to do. And, we all want to make those investments, but, it just, to be quite honest, we do lag a little bit behind. But it also gives us the opportunity to see how these tools are utilized in the private sector and then take advantage of them. So, it's definitely a push-pull, but I think on that workforce piece is the biggest challenge that I see, at least in the telecommunications sector.
Well, I think you're touching on something that's part of this next set of things we want to talk about. It's about building trust. And when people look at the government and they see antiquated technology, or they have a customer experience that feels dated, or they can't access something online that they should do, we start to question the government, especially when the private sector has, as you noted, adopted new technology very rapidly and really changed significantly during the pandemic. So it impacts the way people think about their government, and that impacts trust. And I think building trust is, we've already talked about that a little bit today. We all have a responsibility working in and around government to be focused on this. And I know that there's a lot of money out there. We talked about this already, $1.2 billion. And this money is to improve people's lives, but people are going to be wondering, these are taxpayer dollars, and how is this money being spent? Where is it going? And I'm curious, Shannon, in Alaska, as you're receiving these funds, what kinds of capabilities do you have to track how the money is being spent and, demonstrate accountability and responsible stewardship of these taxpayer dollars?
Yeah, so we actually have had, our statewide, it's basically our federal funding program online, but it certainly wasn't an online tool. We're actually converting now to an e-STIP so that the public can go on there and they can track their project, soup to nuts. They can see how it's moving. If there's a delay, they can, kind of mash that data any way they want to and track it. And I think it's going to go a long way, because one of the number one complaints we get is, I don't understand your spending program. My project was moving forward and then something happened and now it's delayed by 2 years. What's happening? So we really think some of these upgrades will help the public, help our transparency with the public as well.
And right, that public transparency, I think, is really really a key to the way people think about government and how we move forward as a country. And you're Lee and Laurel, as you're impacting rural America, say on telecommunications projects, Laurel, is there a way for the public to see how these funds are being spent and the value that they're bringing to these communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an area that we have really focused a lot of our time and energy, because for our broadband projects, they do touch so many different communities, and we think that there's, a transparency piece we want to have with stakeholders in the community, as well as, companies that are involved in the telecommunications industry. So we have a website at USDA where we have GIS maps, electronic maps of the service areas for each of our awardees, and then we give our clients 5 years to build out their networks. During that time, we actually leverage some of these online tools so that they can report to us regarding where service is made available, and then we use our staff to go out and to monitor that construction. I mean, if there's a piece of that project that doesn't get built out, we hear about it because those people aren't getting that service that they were assured they would have. So we spend a lot of time around that. And it's one of the areas that I think we're really benefiting from some of these newer technologies and what that can do for us, where it enables us to collect very detailed information from our clients and then be very transparent with that as we move forward.
What do you do when you collect that data? Are you you're able to share? Are you doing analysis on it and making decisions, or is it just the benefit of people knowing that some information?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that information is utilized in a multitude of different ways. For us at USDA, the service area maps for our clients is really critical. That's the piece, that's the area that we're going to come back to them and say, hey, did you get that served? We have 25 GFRs all over the country. And so their job, or general field representatives, and their job is to go out and actually monitor these projects. So they'll go on site and they'll see, hey, did you extend that fiber line? Do people in this community have access to service? And then they have tablets that they can use to actually collect the lat longs of the areas that are receiving the service. So we use that at USDA to make decisions. If somebody isn't serving that whole area, then we're going to go back to them. The other thing we do is we share that information with our federal partners. As you have alluded to a couple times on this call, there's a lot of money for infrastructure. And in the broadband world, the infrastructure bill that was passed provided $80 billion for broadband infrastructure funding. We at USDA received $2 billion of that. But so there's a really huge pie out there, right? And so we are working with our federal partners at the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, as well as our partners at the Department of Commerce and at Department of Transportation, all of which have received some type of funding that can support broadband. And so we're trying to share with each other about the geographic areas where we've provided funding, so that we then don't end up having another agency providing, more funding for the same purpose.
Mm-hmm. It's again, a huge amount of money, but I love the fact that there's this cross-government collaboration. I am confident that is what the public is expecting of us as we work these projects, that we're talking and we're communicating. I think you're sharing some really great examples of that. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that we're able to talk about this idea of value and providing value to taxpayers. It's not just about tracking the money, but as we conclude, I'd love for each of you to share, a best practice, an idea around making sure that the value of the work we do is understood, and what does it take to get these projects implemented and successful? What do we have to do to make this all work? And Lee, I'd like to start with you to get your perspective on value and any best practices or lessons learned you have to share as we conclude our webinar.
Yeah, thank you. And we're very new in Rural Partners Network, and our success is going to be predicated on that story that we tell. So, from a best practice perspective, I think it's important that we continue the collaborations that we have. We've identified community networks in the 5 states that I mentioned earlier, and it's important to us that those community networks represent sectoral and personal diversity, and making sure that there's from the equity perspective, making sure that component is covered as well, so we get as many voices at the table as possible, as many useful voices, should I say, at the table as possible, and be able to tell that story as we spear investment into these distressed rural communities.
Thank you, Lee. And David, from a cybersecurity perspective, hard to show value unless the value is you weren't hacked, or the value is you didn't lose your data. It's hard to see that. How do you any best practices or ideas for people to see the value in the work? I
think one best practice is meeting people where they are in terms of their awareness of cyber risks and helping them make informed decisions. That's why our national footprint of 10 regions with over 100 protected security advisors and hundreds more security and other specialists who do outreach to the public where they live, providing awareness, subject matter expertise, and best practice guidance on what to do to avoid being victimized. I think that the value of broadband and the value of all these services is sort of self-evident, and that's why they're so attractive. One thing that is necessary to keep in mind, however, is that when one adopts risky technologies, and these are, while provision and benefits is central, they also bring potential abuse closer to values that we all want to protect. So making sure that people understand that we're there for them nationally to protect not only critical infrastructure that people use, but the well-being, the livelihoods of people who depend on these services. That's something that is our mission, and we work hard on that 24/7, all of it. That's a duty we all feel.
And Shannon, any final thoughts from you and your team in Alaska?
When people are adopting or wanting to adopt new technology, kind of don't be afraid. Go ahead and embrace it. Start small and build up from there, and the public will really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shannon. Great advice. And Laurel, you get to have the final word on the things we should do as a community and a group to demonstrate value, to get these technologies rolled out, and be successful.
No pressure, right? Well, I just want to say, I thought Shannon nailed with the point about starting small. I can't emphasize that enough. I think that's one of the biggest sort of things that we've learned in our world. The other thing I would encourage is, please, for folks in the public, take advantage of folks like Lee and myself and Shannon. I think you guys, I hope, at least at our agency, we really want to be supportive of folks who are in this endeavor. And, I think sometimes people don't assume that they can call the federal government and get a person to connect with them. but we do have staff across the country. We're here to be helpful when we can be, and I would just really encourage anybody who's not sure where to start to reach out to us as a starting point. And I know for myself, I'm happy to connect people to other folks within our organization or other agencies.
Yeah, well, very good. And we learned today rural.gov, lots of resources, CISA.gov, lots of resources. The government is here to help you. It's not a joke, it's real. And you should feel comfortable reaching out. And I know we didn't get to all the questions, and I see some state and local people from different counties and others have asked some things. So I think that's just evidence of how much interest there is in this topic and the need to make sure that we're working together across levels of government and in communities and across stakeholders. And I think you all provided a lot of great ideas on how to do it. This is a topic that we're going to talk about for a long time. The $1.2 billion is a lot of money, and it really has the potential to completely transform the country. And this is an important conversation we had today about how we modernize infrastructure, how we provide cybersecurity, and how we show real value to taxpayers. So Lee and Laurel and Shannon and David, thank you for the work that you do. It's important. You all contributed a great deal to the discussion today, and I learned a lot, and hope we can continue this conversation going forward. To everyone in the audience, thank you for attending, and I want to thank the teams at Fed Insider and my colleagues at ServiceNow for helping to make today's conversation possible. I'd like to turn things back over to Claudia Hosky for some final thoughts and closeout. Claudia?
Thanks again, Jonathan, and thank you to our audience for your questions and comments. We're looking forward to following up with those. Training certificates will be emailed after the webinar ends today. And remember to log back in the next day or two to download a copy of today's captioning transcript. We have many webinars in the works, so be sure to visit fedinsider.com to see what's coming up and to register for multiple events at the same time. And while you're there, you can check out our podcast, Feds at the Edge. And with that, this is Fed Insider signing off.